Do you ever think about those African-American ground beef recipes only your grandparents knew? The ones that tasted like home before we realized what we lost? These meals stretched a little meat into dinners that carried whole families with flavor, care, and pride. What pieces of their kitchen wisdom slipped away without us noticing? Skillet hamburger hash with potatoes was the kind of meal your grandparents leaned on when the day had already taken every ounce of their energy, but the family still needed something warm and filling before bedtime. It always began with ground beef sizzling in a cast iron pan, releasing just enough fat to soften the onions that followed. Then came the diced potatoes, piled high at first, slowly sinking into the pan as the heat worked its way through them. Those potatoes were the real secret, stretching the meat further and soaking up every bit of seasoning until they tasted richer than they had any right to be. Your grandparents learned to flip the potatoes at just the right moment, leaving some edges crisp while letting the centers turn tender and soft. The smell alone brought kids drifting into the kitchen, hoping to snag a crispy piece before the spoon scraped it off the bottom. Sometimes a spoonful of broth was added, sometimes a splash of vinegar or a pinch of paprika, each variation shaped by whatever the pantry allowed that week. Nothing ever went to waste in meals like this. Every bite carried the feeling of care, of resourcefulness, of doing the best you could with what you had. A skillet like this made a house feel steady, even during the hardest years, and families remember those flavors long after the recipe faded from everyday cooking. It was simple food, but it carried a depth that came from generations learning how to make a little stretch a long way. Skillet hamburger hash was not just supper. It was a kind of quiet reassurance passed from one plate to the next. Creole ground beef and rice bake was the sort of meal your grandparents turned to when they wanted something bold, comforting, and steady enough to feed a full table without spending much at all. It always started with ground beef in a deep pan, blended with onions, celery, and green bell pepper, the holy trinity that shaped countless Southern and Gulf Coast suppers. As the vegetables softened, they melted into the meat, releasing a fragrance that wrapped through the kitchen like memory. Tomatoes, garlic, and a touch of hot sauce followed, giving the dish its quiet heat. The rice was cooked separately, then folded in so it could absorb the seasoned juices before everything baked together. Families loved this meal because it fed many and filled the house with a smell that made the day feel easier. Your grandparents seasoned it by instinct, adding a pinch more spice or a splash more sauce depending on who was coming to dinner. Creole ground beef and rice bake was comfort built from tradition and adapted through necessity, a dish that fed both body and memory. Okra and ground beef stew was one of the quiet staples your grandparents relied on during weeks when money was thin, but supper still needed to be hearty. The stew began with browning the ground beef, letting onions soften in its juices until they turned clear and fragrant. Then came the sliced okra, fresh from a garden, or traded from a neighbor who always had plenty. Okra thickened the stew as it cooked, turning the broth rich and velvety without needing anything extra. Tomatoes, peppers, and a bit of broth followed, creating a pot that smelled earthy and warm. Some families added corn or lima beans, others tossed in leftover vegetables that needed to be used. As the stew simmered, the flavors blended into something far deeper than the ingredients alone. Your grandparents ladled it into bowls with pride, knowing it was nourishing, comforting, and built to last. Okra and ground beef stew was a reminder of how families thrived through lean seasons with creativity and patience. Cornbread-topped beef pie was the kind of dish that made an ordinary evening feel special, even when the ingredients were humble. Your grandparents started by browning the ground beef with onions and garlic until the mixture turned savory and fragrant. Vegetables followed, often whatever could be found in the pantry or pulled from the garden. The filling simmered into a warm, hearty base that could have stood on its own. But the cornbread batter poured over the top transformed it, baking into a golden crust that was tender on the bottom and crisp on the surface. The smell filled the house with a sense of abundance, even in hard times. Your grandparents cut generous squares, each serving carrying the perfect blend of sweet cornbread and savory beef. Cornbread-topped beef pie proved that simple ingredients, handled with care, could feel like a celebration. Ground beef and cabbage skillet was a meal your grandparents depended on when they needed to stretch a little meat across many plates. It started with browning the beef until it released enough flavor to soften the onions and garlic. Then came the cabbage, shredded into ribbons that always cooked down into something tender and sweet. As it wilted, it mingled with the beef juices, creating a broth that needed no fancy seasoning to taste full. Some families added vinegar for brightness, others stirred in tomatoes for depth, and many added rice or noodles when they needed the meal to go further. The dish simmered until everything melded together, turning into a comforting supper that filled plates without emptying pockets. Meals like this kept families steady through decades of hardship, proving that hearty food did not require wealth, only patience and a sure hand at the stove. Ground beef and cabbage skillet was survival and comfort woven into one dish. Sweet pepper and beef smothered rice was a meal your grandparents made when they needed color, warmth, and comfort all in one pot without spending much. It began with ground beef browning in a sturdy skillet, releasing just enough fat to soften the onions and garlic. Then came the sweet peppers, sliced into strips that brightened both the pan and the mood. As they softened, their gentle sweetness blended into the savory beef. A pot of rice cooked quietly on the back burner, fluffy and ready to carry the meal. Once combined, each grain absorbed the seasoned juices and pepper flavor. Your grandparents seasoned it by feel, adding paprika, hot sauce, or broth depending on what the week allowed. Some versions added tomatoes, others kept things simple, but every variation carried the same warmth. Children scraped their plates clean because the dish was hearty without being heavy, and adults loved how far it stretched. Sweet pepper and beef smothered rice was a reminder that simple ingredients, handled with care, could make a supper feel complete. Church basement sloppy joes were the heart of community gatherings, the kind of meal that fed dozens and still tasted like something made with love. The recipe began with ground beef browned in a wide skillet, then mixed with onions cooked until soft and fragrant. Tomato sauce, vinegar, mustard, and brown sugar followed, each added with instinct learned over time. As the mixture simmered, it thickened into a sauce that clung to every crumbled piece of meat. In church basements and community halls, long tables waited for families to gather. Children lined up with paper plates, adults poured sweet tea, and the smell drifted through the room like a warm invitation. These sandwiches were messy, but no one cared. They symbolized generosity and the kind of cooking that made people feel welcome. Your grandparents stirred huge pots with wooden spoons nearly as old as the building itself. No one left hungry, and no one left feeling alone. Church basement sloppy joes fed more than bodies. They fed connection. Beef and butter bean supper stew was the kind of meal your grandparents made when they needed something hearty enough to last into the next day. It started with browning the beef until it flavored the onions and celery that followed. Butter beans came next, adding a creaminess without needing milk or cream that many families could not spare. Broth, tomatoes, and whatever vegetables needed using went into the pot because nothing was wasted. As it simmered, the beans thickened the broth, turning it into a stew that clung to the spoon. Children dipped bread into their bowls. Adults ate quietly after long days, and everyone felt restored by its warmth. Your grandparents relied on meals like this because they were dependable and adaptable, fitting whatever the week allowed. Over time, the stew became tied to winter nights and small joys shared around the table. Beef and butter bean supper stew was not flashy, but it carried the quiet strength of those who made it. Southern macaroni and beef casserole was the kind of dinner your grandparents made when they wanted something baked and comforting, the sort of meal that smelled like relief after a long week. It started with ground beef browned with onions, garlic, and chili powder for warmth. Worcestershire sauce deepened the flavor, creating a savory base that wrapped around the macaroni once it was stirred in. Tomatoes, peas, or corn were added to stretch it further because feeding many required creativity. Everything went into a casserole dish and was topped with hand-grated cheese, which older cooks swore melted better than anything from a bag. As it baked, the cheese bubbled and browned into a crust everyone fought over. The sound of the dish hitting the table drew the household close because meals like this promised comfort. Your grandparents served it in large scoops, each bite hearty and familiar. Southern macaroni and beef casserole may be rare now, but in memory it remains a flavor of home. Tomato gravy over ground beef patties was one of those Sunday lunches that made the whole house feel slower and softer. The kind of meal your grandparents prepared with a kind of patience that came from feeding families long before convenience foods existed. The patties were shaped by hand, seasoned by instinct, and browned just enough to build a deep flavor before they simmered in a pot of tomato gravy. That gravy was never rushed. It started with onions cooked until sweet, then tomatoes cooked down until they softened into something thick and comforting. A pinch of sugar balanced the acidity, a splash of vinegar sharpened it, and everything else depended on the cook's mood and memory. As the patties simmered, they soaked up the gravy, becoming tender enough to cut with the side of a fork. Children would mop their plates with cornbread or biscuits, not wanting to waste a single streak of sauce. Meals like this were more than food. They were tradition, a reminder of Sundays spent together after long weeks where everyone carried more than they let on. Tomato gravy over ground beef patties tasted like comfort shaped by hands that knew exactly what families needed. Beefy mustard green skillet was the kind of dish grandparents made on nights when they needed something hearty, but did not have the time or the ingredients for a long stew. Mustard greens grew fast, grew plentiful, and brought a bold, peppery flavor that could make even a small amount of beef feel like a feast. Ground beef was cooked first, releasing enough fat to soften the onions and garlic before the greens were piled into the pan. As the greens wilted, they soaked in the beef juices, turning tender and savory with just enough bite to remind everyone where the flavor came from. Some families added vinegar, others added hot sauce, and many added crushed red pepper for a slow warmth that spread through the whole dish. Children who might have avoided greens on their own ate them without question when they carried the richness of beef. This skillet was simple fuel, built from ingredients that kept families full during long seasons of work. Meals like this were proof that older generations understood how to stretch flavor and nourishment with experience rather than expense. Beefy mustard green skillet was not fancy, but it fed people with honesty and strength. Ground beef and rice, stuffed bell peppers were the kind of dish your grandparents saved for Sundays or for the rare evenings when the family needed something that felt like a celebration. Bell peppers were sliced open and hollowed out, then filled with a mixture of ground beef, rice, onions, and tomatoes, seasoned just the way older cooks liked, slow, steady, and full of heart. As the peppers baked, their edges softened and their sweetness deepened, turning each one into a small, edible bowl of comfort. Some families topped them with breadcrumbs for a crisp finish. Others added cheese when it was available, but the real magic came from the filling. The rice made the beef stretch further. The tomatoes kept everything moist, and the peppers held it all together in a way that felt generous. Children loved the presentation, adults loved the flavor, and everyone loved how a single pepper felt like a full meal. These stuffed peppers carried the spirit of a time when food did not need to be complicated to feel meaningful. They tasted like gatherings, like quiet afternoons spent around a worn kitchen table. And even now, one bite brings back memories of home. Beef and onion pan gravy, spoon bread was a dish your grandparents made when they wanted something warm and soothing, a kind of comfort that sank into the bones after long days of work. Spoon bread itself was soft, almost like a cross between cornbread and custard, baked until the top set and the inside stayed tender enough to scoop with a spoon. But what made the meal unforgettable was the pan gravy poured over the top. Ground beef was browned with onions until everything turned rich and fragrant, then simmered with a bit of broth and thickened slowly into a silky gravy that carried deep, savory flavor. When spoon bread soaked in that gravy, it transformed into something far more comforting than its simple ingredients suggested. Families sat quietly as they ate, letting the warmth settle in. Children scraped the corners of their bowls, chasing the last spoonfuls. Meals like this were not about luxury. They were about solace, about making a small pot of ingredients feel like abundance. Beef and onion pan gravy spoon bread tasted like rest, like steadiness, like the kind of care only older generations truly mastered. Okra tomato beef hot pot was the kind of layered dish your grandparents made when they needed something filling enough to last through the next day, but simple enough to assemble without fuss. The pot always began with browned beef seasoned with onions and garlic. Then came layers of fresh okra, ripe tomatoes, and sometimes potatoes or corn. Each layer brought its own texture and its own depth of flavor. As the pot simmered, the okra softened and thickened the broth naturally, blending with the tomatoes to create a sauce that clung to every bite. Families often ate it with cornbread, letting the bread soak in the juices until it tasted like a meal on its own. Dishes like this came from a tradition of practicality, of making the most of whatever the garden or pantry offered. The hot pot fed many, reheated well, and carried the warmth of southern kitchens shaped by generations. Okra tomato beef hot pot was food for long days, long weeks, and long memories. Beef and hominy skillet supper was a dish shaped by older cooks who knew how to make simple ingredients taste like something much bigger. Hominy brought a chewy, hearty texture that filled out the meal without costing much. When mixed with ground beef browned alongside onions, garlic, and sweet peppers, the skillet turned into a blend of smoky, savory flavors that tasted deeper than the recipe looked. Some grandparents added a pinch of chili powder, others added paprika or broth, and everyone seemed to have a special way of getting the seasoning just right. Hominy soaked in the beef juices, carrying the smoky undertone that made the dish memorable. The skillet fed many without draining the pantry, making it a dependable supper during lean years. Meals like this spoke to the creativity of older generations who learned to stretch ingredients with care and confidence. Beef and hominy skillet supper was humble but unforgettable, the kind of food that made families feel full in more ways than one. Country fried ground beef patties were the kind of meal your grandparents made when they wanted something crisp, comforting, and sturdy enough to hold up after a long day. Ground beef was shaped into patties, seasoned by hand, then dredged lightly in flour before hitting a hot skillet. The flour formed a thin crust that crackled at the edges, while the inside stayed tender and juicy. Once fried, the patties were served with rice, mashed potatoes, or biscuits, depending on what was available. Some families topped them with gravy, others ate them plain, but either way they were satisfying. Children loved the crispy edges, adults appreciated how far a little beef could go, and everyone enjoyed a meal that felt hearty without being complicated. This dish represented the practical side of home cooking: simple steps, simple ingredients, big comfort. Country fried ground beef patties were proof that older cooks knew how to turn the ordinary into something memorable. Beef and rutabaga winter stew was the kind of cold weather meal that kept families warm long before central heating became common. Rutabagas lasted through winter storage, making them one of the most dependable vegetables older cooks had. When chopped and simmered with ground beef, onions, garlic, and simple seasoning, the stew became thick, earthy, and deeply satisfying. The rutabagas softened slowly, absorbing the flavor of the meat while adding their own gentle sweetness. Some families added carrots or potatoes. Others kept it simple, relying on the rutabagas to do most of the work. The pot simmered for hours, filling the house with a comforting aroma. Bowls of this stew were eaten slowly, giving warmth that lingered long after dinner ended. Meals like this were shaped by practicality, by knowledge passed through generations about how to survive harsh seasons with steady nourishment. Beef and rutabaga winter stew was survival wrapped in comfort. Red pea and ground beef stew was a dish your grandparents cooked when they needed something hearty enough to feed many but gentle enough to simmer without constant attention. Red field peas softened beautifully in a slow-cooked pot, absorbing the juices from the ground beef until they turned almost creamy. Onions, peppers, and tomatoes added depth, while simple spices gave the stew its warmth. Some households added rice toward the end, others served the stew as it was, letting the peas carry the heart of the dish. The pot simmered quietly, thickening slowly, building flavor hour by hour. Families ladled it into bowls with gratitude, knowing it would last through the next day if needed. This stew represented a time when meals were built from what the land or pantry offered. Red pea and ground beef stew carried the taste of tradition, shaped by hands that cooked with memory and resourcefulness. Picnic-style beef sandwich spread was a staple of church gatherings, school lunches, and community events where feeding many with little was an art perfected by older generations. Ground beef was cooked with onions, seasoned gently, then mixed into a creamy spread made with mustard, mayonnaise, or relish depending on the cook's preference. The mixture chilled until firm, then was spread thick on soft bread or crackers. It was simple, filling, and easy to transport, making it ideal for long days spent outdoors or in fellowship halls. Children loved the mild, savory flavor, adults appreciated how far a single batch could go, and everyone knew exactly how comforting one of these sandwiches could be. Picnic-style beef sandwich spread was proof that practical food could still carry warmth and memory. Beef and sweet onion baked rice was the kind of oven dish your grandparents made when they wanted something that tasted slow-cooked but required only a bit of preparation. Ground beef was browned with thick slices of sweet onions until the onions softened and released their natural sugars. Rice was added with broth, then everything baked until the grains absorbed every drop of flavor. As it cooked, the onions caramelized deeper, turning the entire dish fragrant and comforting. The top developed a gentle crust, while the inside stayed tender and rich. Families loved meals like this because they were dependable, filling, and easy to serve. Beef and sweet onion baked rice tasted like home, warm, steady, and made with care. Southern beef croquettes with pan sauce were the kind of dish grandparents made when there was just a little ground beef left and every bit needed to count. The meat was mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and seasonings, then shaped into small croquettes meant to stretch what would have otherwise fed only 2 people. Once formed, they were fried until the outside turned crisp and golden, while the inside stayed tender and warm. The pan sauce came from the drippings left behind, cooked with onions and a splash of broth until it thickened into something rich enough to make the meal feel complete. Families often served croquettes with rice or mashed potatoes, letting the sauce soak through everything on the plate. These croquettes were born from resourcefulness, but they never tasted like compromise. They tasted like care, experience, and the quiet pride that came from turning leftovers into something memorable. Southern beef croquettes with pan sauce were proof of how older cooks made even the smallest amount feel abundant. Ground beef succotash supper was a bowl of comfort shaped by rural southeastern foodways, where corn and lima beans were always close at hand and ground beef made the whole dish feel like a complete meal. The beef was browned first, then mixed with onions, peppers, and garlic before the vegetables were stirred in. Corn added sweetness, lima beans added earthiness, and together they created a balance older cooks cherished. Everything simmered in one pot, allowing the flavors to mingle into something simple but satisfying. This was the kind of dish that fed large families without much cost, relying on pantry staples and whatever seasonings were available. Grandparents served it with cornbread or rice, both of which stretched the meal even further. Succotash supper was humble, steady food, built to nourish and keep people going. It carried the taste of long summers, family gardens, and the resourcefulness that defined generations. Beef and turnip green pot was a meal made for days when families needed something filling, earthy, and deeply nourishing. Turnip greens simmered down beautifully, softening into the broth while keeping their distinct flavor. When cooked with ground beef, onions, and simple seasoning, the pot gained a richness that felt far greater than its ingredient list. This was the kind of meal grandparents learned to make from those who came before them, people who knew how to coax comfort out of whatever the land offered. Turnip greens grew quickly and grew strong, making them a reliable vegetable even in difficult seasons. As the pot simmered, the greens absorbed the beef juices and took on a tenderness that made every spoonful satisfying. Families ate it with cornbread or rice, letting the juices soak into each bite. Beef and turnip green pot was food made with wisdom, thrift, and a deep understanding of how to feed many with few resources. It tasted like tradition carried forward. Molasses glazed meat roll was a home-style favorite that brought sweetness and comfort to the dinner table long before convenience sauces existed. Ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, then shaped into a firm roll that baked slowly in the oven. What made it special was the glaze, a simple mixture brushed over the top that baked into a dark, shiny coating. Molasses added depth and sweetness, turning every slice into a blend of savory and rich flavor that felt both hearty and nostalgic. As the meat roll baked, the glaze caramelized, filling the house with a warm smell older generations never forgot. This dish was often served with potatoes, greens, or simple vegetables, making it a complete meal without much expense. It was the kind of recipe passed quietly between families, a reminder of times when simple ingredients created the most memorable meals. Molasses glazed meat roll may be rare today, but it remains a treasured piece of older kitchen wisdom. Peanut-seasoned ground beef stew carried the quiet influence of West African cooking traditions, where peanuts were used to thicken stews and enrich their flavor. Grandparents browned the beef first, then added onions, peppers, and garlic before stirring in peanuts or peanut butter to create a rich, velvety base. Tomatoes and broth helped everything blend together, turning the stew into something warming and deeply satisfying. The peanuts added a subtle sweetness and a creamy texture that made the meal feel more substantial than its cost suggested. Families served it with rice or bread, letting the stew soak into every bite. This was food shaped by heritage, memory, and the blending of old techniques with new ingredients. Peanut-seasoned ground beef stew was not just nourishing, it was a quiet celebration of roots carried across generations. Beef and black-eyed pea casserole was a dish that often appeared around the new year, when black-eyed peas symbolized hope and good fortune. Ground beef gave the casserole its richness, while the peas brought warmth and tradition to the pan. Onions, peppers, and rice were usually added, turning the dish into a complete meal that stretched far without stretching the budget. Everything baked together until the flavors melded into something comforting and familiar. Some families added tomatoes, others topped the casserole with cheese, but every version carried the same sense of celebration. This was a meal meant to gather people at the table, to welcome good days ahead with humble but meaningful ingredients. Beef and black-eyed pea casserole tasted like optimism seasoned with memory. Beef tomato rice dressing was a coastal Louisiana staple, the kind of dish meant to feed a crowd with flavor rather than expensive ingredients. Ground beef was browned with onions, celery, and peppers, then simmered with tomatoes until everything cooked down into a savory mixture. Rice absorbed the juices, turning fluffy and richly seasoned as it baked or simmered together with the meat. The result was a pot full of warmth, depth, and unmistakable Southern character. Families made it for gatherings, holidays, and days when there were more people at the table than usual. It was simple, reliable, and beloved, carrying the taste of home even for those who moved far from the coast. Beef tomato rice dressing was proof that good food did not need extravagance, only tradition and a steady hand. Ground beef corn fritters were the kind of treat grandparents fried up for gatherings, late-night snacks, or afternoons when children crowded the kitchen hoping for something warm and crispy. Cornmeal batter formed the base, mixed with sweet kernels of corn and seasoned ground beef. Spoonfuls of the mixture hit the hot oil and puffed into golden fritters, crisp on the outside and soft within. The beef added richness, the corn added sweetness, and together they made a flavor that felt both playful and comforting. Fritters were easy to make, easy to share, and always disappeared quickly from the plate. They carried the spirit of community, of family kitchens where food meant connection. Ground beef corn fritters were humble, joyful bites of memory. Smothered hamburger steak with peppers was one of those grown folks' dinners that carried weight, warmth, and a kind of quiet pride. Beef patties were shaped thick and seasoned well, then browned in a skillet before being covered in a mixture of onions, peppers, and gravy. As everything simmered, the patties absorbed the flavors, turning tender enough to cut with a fork. The gravy thickened and clung to the meat, rich with the sweetness of the vegetables. This was the kind of dinner adults made after long days, meant to restore strength and calm tired minds. Served with rice or potatoes, smothered hamburger steak was steady, soulful food. It tasted like care you could feel in every bite. Beef and sweet potato skillet mix was a dish shaped by resourcefulness, combining the savory richness of beef with the natural sweetness of sweet potatoes. The skillet began with browning the meat, then adding onions and peppers before the chunks of sweet potato went in. As everything cooked together, the sweet potatoes softened and caramelized, adding warmth and balance to the beef. Some grandparents added spices like paprika or cinnamon, blending savory and sweet in a way that felt both comforting and familiar. The dish stretched easily, feeding many without requiring much. It was the kind of meal that made use of what the land offered, honoring the resourcefulness of earlier generations. Beef and sweet potato skillet mix tasted like ingenuity and home. Scalloped potatoes with onion and cheese were baked love layered in a pan. Thin slices of potato, creamy sauce, and sharp cheese melted together until bubbling and golden brown. The edges crisped while the center stayed soft and rich, creating that perfect mix of textures. For Christmas dinners, this dish brought comfort and elegance at once. It was often made in heavy glass or cast iron dishes, still warm when placed on the table. The onions gave sweetness, the cheese brought depth, and the potatoes carried it all with quiet strength. Families would crowd around, spoons clinking against the sides as they reached for seconds. It was the kind of dish that didn't need announcing. Its smell spoke first. African-American home cooks added their own touches: a bit of paprika, a sprinkle of garlic, or a splash of evaporated milk for richness. It was a recipe passed quietly between generations, unchanged because it was already perfect. When it came out of the oven, the whole house smelled like warmth, patience, and tradition. Coconut cake was the tall, white winter bright dessert covered in soft flakes that clung to the frosting like new fallen snow, making it one of the most beautiful desserts on any reunion table. The cake layers baked into soft, tender rounds that held moisture well, especially when brushed lightly with sweet coconut milk or simple syrup to deepen the flavor. The frosting was smooth and fluffy, often made from cooked icing or whipped cream cheese depending on the family recipe, and once spread across the cake, it formed the perfect base for the final snowy coating. Handfuls of coconut were pressed gently against the sides, falling lightly across the top until the cake looked like something crafted for celebration. Its flavor was light sweet and refreshing, offering a cool softness that balanced the heavier, richer desserts around it. Coconut cake tasted like reunions. Church gatherings and holidays rolled into one dessert as children reached for it, first drawn to the snowy look while adults reached for it last, wanting to savor the gentle sweetness. Buttermilk pancakes with sorghum syrup were the taste of Southern Christmas mornings, sweet, warm, and steady. Grandparents stirred batter smooth in a big bowl, the sound of the whisk keeping rhythm with gospel playing low on the radio. The griddle hissed as each ladle of batter hit, spreading into circles that browned just right. When stacked high, the pancakes steamed like soft clouds waiting for the pour. Sorghum syrup, thick and dark, flowed slow over the top, pooling in the edges. Its taste was deep, old-fashioned, with hints of caramel and smoke. Families gathered sleepy-eyed around the table, watching the syrup drip and laughing softly at the morning quiet. Every forkful was sweet and grounding, comfort that didn't need decoration. Pancakes were never just pancakes. They were a small promise of good things ahead, a Christmas tradition that spoke of love more than luxury. Pound cake made in heavy Bundt pans was the blueprint dessert that every grandmother had her own version of, and she would defend that version like it was family law. Thick, dense, buttery, and reliable, pound cake sat on every holiday table, whether it was Thanksgiving, Christmas, or a Sunday gathering that ran long. The Bundt pan itself carried history, scratched and seasoned from years of baking. Grandma creamed the butter and sugar until her arm ached, then added eggs one by one like steps in a ritual. The batter was always heavy, and so was the responsibility of not wasting a drop. When the cake baked, it rose slow and steady, filling the house with a smell that made kids wander into the kitchen like sleepwalkers. Pound cake sliced clean, held its shape, and paired with anything: ice cream, fruit, or just a quiet moment alone. It was the dessert that reminded families that sometimes the simplest things lasted the longest. Hog maw and potatoes was a breakfast that carried both weight and flavor for households that needed energy for the day ahead. Hog maw, or hog stomach, was cleaned carefully, seasoned, and slow-cooked until tender. Potatoes were added to the pot, soaking up the rich broth and spices as they simmered together. The result was a dish that was hearty, savory, and deeply satisfying, often eaten in large portions to provide strength before long hours in the fields or factories. Though not a delicacy, it was respected because it made use of parts of the hog that otherwise might have been discarded. The combination of meat and potatoes provided both protein and comfort, ensuring that families started their mornings with something filling. Hog maw and potatoes reflected resilience, turning less desirable cuts into meals that carried pride and tradition. Though it is rarely seen on tables today, it once served as a dependable morning staple. Chess pie was the pantry-friendly reunion dessert that proved simple ingredients could create something unforgettable with only a few motions of a practiced hand. Egg, sugar, buttermilk, and a scoop of cornmeal mixed into a smooth, pale filling that baked into a golden top with a delicate crackle and a custard center that tasted sweet, warm, and familiar. The pie needed no fruit, no glaze, no decoration, because its flavor stood strong on its own, carrying a richness that came from the balance of creamy custard and a hint of cornmeal texture. At reunions, chess pie sat quietly beside the fancier desserts, but it never stayed untouched, because those who knew it understood its power. Each slice tasted like tradition thrift and the creativity of cooks who made something special from what they had on the shelf. Sweet potato cornbread was where bread met dessert and soul met comfort. Its deep orange color glowed like evening light, and its flavor walked the line between savory and sweet. Mashed sweet potatoes blended with cornmeal, sugar, and butter to create a moist, golden loaf that could stand on its own. For Christmas dinners, it was the first thing to disappear from the table. Each bite carried the flavor of the earth and the warmth of the kitchen, a sweet echo of care and creativity. In many families, this cornbread replaced plain loaves. It was softer, richer, and somehow more personal. The smell alone could bring everyone to the table before the food was even called. Served with a pat of butter or a drizzle of honey, it was comfort in its purest form. It showed how Black cooks blended tradition with imagination, always finding new ways to turn simple ingredients into something unforgettable. One slice could make you feel full, not just in stomach, but in spirit. Cheese grits casserole was the Southern gift that made Christmas brunch feel complete. Grandparents mixed slow-cooked grits with butter, eggs, and a mountain of shredded cheese until the pot turned golden and glossy. Poured into a baking dish, it went into the oven to rise, the top forming a soft crust that bubbled at the edges. When it came out, the house filled with the scent of warmth and home. The casserole was creamy and rich, each spoonful smooth like velvet, with a hint of salt and sharp cheddar. It was shared at tables surrounded by cousins, friends, and faith. Served beside ham, sausage, or fried apples, it tied every plate together. Cheese grits casserole wasn't just food, it was comfort made tangible, the taste of Christmas morning and all its quiet joy. Even the leftovers felt like love reheated. The way it held heat long after leaving the oven made it the heart of every brunch table. Grandparents would scoop it proudly, watching butter melt into every golden layer. It was both humble and grand, a dish that felt like sunlight on a cold morning. Cheese grits casserole carried the story of the South, slow-cooked, soulful, and full of love that lingered in every bite. Chocolate sheet cake was the reunion dessert designed to feed a crowd with soft, generous squares that children grabbed with both hands while adults reached for the corner pieces thick with frosting. The batter mixed into a smooth, dark pour that baked quickly in a large pan, rising into a tender cake that stayed moist even in summer heat. The warm cake received a melted chocolate frosting that spread easily over the top, settling into a shiny, smooth layer that cracked softly under the knife. Families loved it because one pan held enough for everyone, and because the flavor was rich, comforting, and impossible to resist. Chocolate sheet cake tasted like togetherness, celebration, and the joy of passing plates down long tables one piece after another. Stewed cabbage with onions and vinegar was a dish that hugged the cold right out of the winter. It was simple: cabbage sliced fine, simmered with onions, salt, pepper, and a touch of vinegar to wake everything up. As it cooked, the kitchen filled with a tangy, savory aroma that felt like family itself. The steam rose from the pot like an invitation to gather. On Christmas tables, it sat proudly beside roast meats and cornbread, balancing the richness with its clean, bright flavor. It reminded everyone that good food did not need excess, only care. The vinegar gave it life, cutting through the heaviness of the season's indulgence, while the onions made it sweet and familiar. For many Black families, this dish came from memories of gardens and preservation, of using what the land gave with gratitude. It was not fancy, but it was honest, and that honesty made it beautiful. Every spoonful tasted like warmth, comfort, and the wisdom of making the most out of what you have. Molasses stack cake was the layered reunion dessert that carried Appalachian history into Black family gatherings where traditions blended and traveled through generations. Thin cake layers were baked one at a time in well-greased pans, each one soft, warm, and smelling of ginger cinnamon and deep molasses, sweetness. The filling was made from cooked molasses or spiced fruit spread into glossy layers that softened the cake as it rested overnight, turning the entire stack into a tender, richly flavored dessert that cut cleanly into tall slices. The cake was humble yet impressive, built from repetition, patience, and steady hands, moving in practiced rhythm across the kitchen. At reunions, it stood out because its flavor was warm and old-fashioned, and its height made people gather around with curiosity and appreciation. Every bite carried slow winter baking, homegrown molasses, and the memory of cooks who stretched ingredients into something celebratory. Molasses stack cake tasted like time effort and love stacked carefully into something sweet enough to share across an entire family. Field peas and snap beans were a southern duo that spoke of harvest and home. They simmered together in big pots, filling kitchens with a fragrance that meant Christmas had truly arrived. Field peas brought hearty depth, while snap beans added freshness and bite. The dish was simple: peas, beans, onions, and a piece of smoked meat for seasoning, but it tasted like abundance. It carried the memory of summer fields into winter homes, a reminder of the labor and love behind every meal. For Black families in the South, growing and cooking these together was both survival and pride. When shared during holidays, they symbolized community, everyone bringing something from their garden or pantry to the table. This side dish was rich in flavor and meaning, nourishing both body and spirit. It reflected the way people made the most of what the earth gave them, combining ingredients that grew side by side. The sound of the simmering pot was steady and comforting, a rhythm as old as the land itself. Few make it today, but for those who remember, the taste is like coming home again. Rice porridge with butter and sugar was quiet comfort, the kind of breakfast that soothed cold Christmas mornings. Grandparents simmered leftover rice in milk until it softened into a creamy base. A spoonful of butter melted on top, swirling gold into white. Sugar sprinkled over it turned the first bite into nostalgia, sweet, soft, and warm. It filled the stomach and calmed the spirit, a meal that asked for nothing but a slow moment. Some added cinnamon, others raisins, but the magic was in the simplicity. It was food that wrapped you up like a blanket, reminding you that even leftovers could feel like luxury when made with love. Families sat close, sharing stories between bites, steam rising from their bowls. Rice porridge with butter and sugar wasn't loud or showy, it was memory itself, humble and full of grace. Red velvet cake with cream cheese frosting was the showstopper that signaled a celebration long before anyone sliced into the deep red layers shimmering under thick white frosting. The batter mixed into a smooth, vibrant red color that felt dramatic and festive as it poured into pans waiting to bake into soft, tender layers that held moisture like a secret. Once cooled, each layer was stacked carefully with generous spreads of cream cheese frosting, smooth, rich, and tangy enough to balance the sweetness of the cake. At reunions, this cake never blended into the background because its color stood bold against every other dessert, drawing eyes and calling people forward even before the meal was finished. Elders sliced it with pride, remembering holidays, anniversaries, and Sundays when red velvet marked something important. The flavor was warm, gentle, and comforting with a subtle cocoa note that made every bite feel familiar, even for those tasting it. For the first time, red velvet cake was a symbol of family joy tradition and the belief that reunions deserved a dessert that felt truly special. If any of these recipes reminded you of someone's kitchen, share your memory in the comments and tap like and subscribe so more stories like yours can find their way home.